So in the beginning of this course, we talked about, there are other topics within the federal aid. Environmental is one of them. So I'm going to touch upon just some real basics. I'm only going to scratch the surface in terms of the federal aid. Like I said, it's a separate module. And so environmental is a planning activity that evaluates the natural and human setting of a project. It is important to obtain public input from open hearings and meetings. Obtaining environmental clearance is required by law. Under California state law, it's CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that defines the process. But under our federal, it's NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA is required if a project uses federal funds, involves federal lands, or requires a federal permit. Under agreement with FHWA, Caltrans has been assigned NEPA lead agency for all federal aid projects in California. Local agencies are the lead for CEQA. The preliminary environmental study, it's called the PES form, is designed to provide early coordination needed to determine required technical studies, the level of analysis, and the NEPA class of action or required document. CE, which is category exclusion, do not have any significant environmental impacts. EA, environmental assessment, is used in cases where there will be significant environmental impacts, but does not require the preparation of an EIS, which is an environmental impact statement. It is a full disclosure document and is the highest level analysis required by FHWA. What I'm showing you here is the PES, the preliminary. It identifies areas of impact associated with the project. Estimating the time required for preparing and processing technical studies and environmental documents is very important when establishing a project delivery schedule. The amount of time needed to demonstrate full compliance with the provisions of NEPA and other federal environmental requirements varies depending upon project scope and the presence of federally protected environmental resources within the immediately or adjacent to the project area. These are just estimated timeframes. So a CE, a categorical exclusion, could be 2 months, 6 months to 2 years. For the environmental assessment, we're talking 2 to 3 years, and a full environmental impact statement could be 3 to 4 years. Again, these are just estimates based on past experiences. Another area we're going to just touch upon is right-of-way. Federal Aid Series also includes a separate right-of-way course. So this was kind of a question that was asked earlier about preliminary right-of-way activities that may be considered eligible and authorized part of the PE include pre-acquisition activities such as estimating, title searches, preliminary property map preparation and studies. These are all needed as part of NEPA. There is a new preliminary right-of-way checklist, which is our LAPM Exhibit 13E, and that became effective a year ago, November 1st. This is required for all federally funded local projects and submitted along with the PES form. This will notify our right-of-way local programs coordinator to monitor and advise local agencies through the right-of-way process. After NEPA approval, right-of-way acquisition may begin. Right-of-way authorization must be approved before any written offers are made. For utility relocation, NEPA must also be approved. And the FTIP must have federally funds programmed for the right-of-way phase to be eligible, of course, for federal reimbursement. One critical requirement, whether federal funds are not used for right-of-way, the project must follow the Uniform Relocation Act. One thing I didn't mention under like I said, under NEPA, I'm going to step back, is that if there is $1 of federal funds anywhere on the project, NEPA will be required. So I kind of touched base, but I want to emphasize, even if federal funds are not used for environmental, NEPA will be required. If federal funds are used for construction, for example.
And Peter, just to reemphasize, if you don't know for sure where all your construction funds are coming from, and there's a chance that they may be federalized, even though you're currently using local or state funds, you'd want to try to follow these federal rules so that if that federal funding comes available later, you're already ready to go. Otherwise, you have to stop dead and catch up and do NEPA, once you're already, down the road. So just another thing to plan.
It happens. So right away, certification is necessary for all construction authorizations and must be consistent with the project's approved PSNE. The purpose of the right-of-way cert is to document that any interests necessary for the project have been or are being secured, and physical obstructions, including buildings, utilities, railroads, have been or will be removed, relocated, or protected as required for construction, operation, and maintenance of the facility. The right-of-way certification also documents that right-of-way activities included the relocation of any displaced persons is conducted in accordance with applicable state and federal laws and regulations. A right-of-way cert is still required even if no right-of-way is required for the project. And we talk about there are 4 levels of right-of-way certification. I'm just going to scratch the surface of these. A Cert 1, all work is within the existing right-of-way. A Cert 2, similar to a Cert 1, except that one or more parcels are in the agency's possession by virtue of agreement with the property owner. Cert 3, also similar, except a few remaining parcels are not in possession, is not complete. The agency must include anticipated dates when legal possession will be obtained. The Cert 3 is used in a very limited basis under exceptional circumstances. And if it goes forward, any bids cannot be opened until the certification of 3 has been upgraded to a Cert 2 at least. The 4th cert is a Cert 3 with a workaround. Similar to the 3, this is very special right-of-way cert used in most extraordinary circumstances. The local agency must show that there is critical need to advertise and award the project and describe in detail the extraordinary circumstances. Both the Cert 3 and 3 workaround require approval by Caltrans right-of-way. But the Cert 3 does not need to be raised to a Cert 1 or 2, but must be updated to provide any progress towards pertaining to the workaround parcels. Again, those are used in very limited. From my experience of 15 years, I may have only dealt with 1 or 2 Cert 3s.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that the Cert 1 and the Cert 2 require district Caltrans approval when there's federal funds. If it's a local state-only funded project, then the agency gets to certify their right of way. But for federal projects, Caltrans has to certify. So Cert 1 and 2 are done by the district, and Cert 3s are done at headquarters. So it takes more time.
And one other thing is a right-of-way cert over 1 year old from the time local agency submits the request for authorization for construction must be updated, confirm that there are no project scope changes, and must be recertified. So there is a life of a certification.
And just to note, that's true for the NEPA document also. Maybe not 1 year, but if the NEPA document is already 2-3 years old before you start construction, you'll need to recertify the NEPA document.
Yeah,
that doesn't take very long. A week.
The NEPA does not have any absolutes in terms of when the certification needs to be redone. The environmental people basically say when it goes to the next phase, consider doing a recertification. So when it goes, so during the PE phase, when the NEPA document will be approved during that time phase before it goes into final design. We here at Caltrans, we do not see that phase on it generally. We'll get it when it goes to construction. That will be a new phase, and therefore it needs to be considered to do a revalidation.
And Peter, while we're talking about that, there's a question in the Q&A that says, what if the second phase of your project gets federal funds? Do you need to do NEPA for the previous phase? I'm assuming in the way that that's done, we're not talking about the phase of a project as in PE, right away construction, but they're talking about a large project that's divided into pieces, which is also uses the word phase, which can be confusing. So if you have a project where you're doing, you know, the first 2 blocks of a project, then you know, that stands alone, and the federal funding rules are just for that 2 block thing. And then if you start the next piece of an overall project, that's the 3rd and 4th blocks, then that stands alone. And if that's all local state funded, then you don't need to do NEPA for that. There's considered 2 separate projects, even though they're similar, and the community is looking at that as one major improvement. Is that right, Peter? Am I getting that?
Yeah, that's correct. So you think of phase as just like I said, one project. Yes, it's different components. A lot of times when you have those type of phase projects, there's actually a single environmental document that covers the entire project. It just goes to say, and then construction then is broken into multiple phases. So yes, one thing that's very important on the environmental is that the environmental document has, and same with the right-of-way, sir, has to cover the entire project. I mentioned this morning about, the FTIP it says one thing. You can do work outside the FTIP limits. It's just non-participating. You cannot do that for either the right-of-way cert or the environmental document. It must cover the entire scope of the work. So it's like, well, we're going to do this, clear this part, we're going to combine this other work, but we can't clear that environmentally. That is not allowed. It would have to be totally treated as a separate project. Is there any other questions we want to cover right now?
Maybe just because we're in right away, but these were NEPA questions, and we're kind of in that regard. So one I'll wait on, that was to expand the difference between NEPA and CEQA approval, but the other one was, does CEQA require any recertification within a year like NEPA? And again, NEPA doesn't have a 1 year rule for certification. That's the right-of-way cert.
Well,
NEPA should be reviewed and verified that the NEPA matches the current scope and or has been modified to match the current scope. CEQA should do the same thing.
the one thing about CEQA is you, the local agency, are
And you're
the
providing the environmental documents. Those environmental documents need to cover the scope. It looks like my internet is going. I'll let you go, Peter.
oh, okay. CEQA is the local agency. They're the responsible entity regards to CEQA. The Caltrans state has no responsibility on that. So we do not have anything to say as to when it needs to be recertified. It's up to the local agency to make that determination. I will kind of expand just the difference between NEPA and CEQA, and it's really simple. NEPA is federal laws, and it's based off of that. CEQA is based off of state laws. I'm not really going to get into any nitty-gritty details because I'm not an environmental expert. I highly recommend that type of thing would be discussed, through the environmental course. All right. Continuing on with right-of-way now. So for local assistance projects off the state highway system, talking about off the state highway system, local assistance provides two different forms for certifying the right-of-way, called the 13A, which is known as the short form. And this may be used if there are no right-of-way activities involved with the project except for utility cover adjustments. The 13B is used when it's not appropriate to use the 13A. So if there's any type of there is any kind of acquisition, it could be a construction easement, then you need to go to the 13B. And when you're filling out the form, the 13A, you fill out that form, each section will prompt you to say whether this form is appropriate or not, and it'll say stop and use the longer form.
And Peter, there's a question that relates to the funding of, in this case, the cover adjustments. So again, for right-of-way, your right-of-way cert needs to cover the whole project, regardless of where the funds for each component is coming from. So if you have any federal funds on the project at all, the whole project has been federalized. And so even if the cost for dealing with a cover adjustment or utility adjustment is going to be covered with local funds, it still needs to be covered under the right-of-way cert.
Yes. So I'm reading the question. So if there is a utility involved with the project, I think I talk about this in a minute here. So let me just go on. Because I think I'm going to talk about utilities. I'm going to talk about utilities here in a moment, so might help that. So for utilities, the cost to relocate may be federally eligible if the agency is legally responsible for the cost and the relocation is necessary by the proposed construction. And all utility conflicts must be identified as early as possible. The liability. I jumped way ahead here. And this liability determination must be made to determine whether the local agency is legally liable for any portion of the relocation costs. And the Caltrans right-of-way manual actually covers the requirements in dealing with projects on the state highway system. So we've been talking about our local system, but when you go to projects on the state highway, this is all dictated by the state right-of-way guidance. So the key behind this is that, so when you go through the utility process, starts with mapping of utilities, identifying conflicts, and develop a plan for relocating. If the local agency is liable, then an authorization for utility relocation will be required unless the relocation will occur during the construction phase. The specific authorization, this is another one of our forms, the LAPM 14C. This must be attached to the right-of-way cert, whether the utility relocation happens before or during construction, or if done by the utility owner or construction contractor. Approval authority of utility agreements has been delegated to the Caltrans district utility coordinator. And occasionally, if you're working construction, unforeseen utilities are discovered during construction. Then it's a matter of obtaining written or verbal authorization. The local agency must furnish a written submittal to the DLA confirming that the information contained is fully documented for the relocation plan. So it's just working with the utility coordinator, get this approved. So the key thing on this is that an investigation of liability has to occur with the right-of-way personnel. And from that investigation, it will be a matter of determination of the liability of relocating the utility, whether it is the local agency's responsibility or if it's the utility. There's no absolute answers. There's no absolute answer as to this. If this happens, then this. It doesn't work that way at all. It all comes down to this investigation. So there was a question about private utility covers that are bid items cannot be paid by federal funds. So we would, if there are utilities that need to be located that are not federally eligible, they can be incorporated into the construction contract and they will be classified as non-participating work. And we'll be showing that in an example in a little bit.
Peter, I think the next question has to do with a clarification of the state highway system and the federal aid system.
Yeah.
And so in the case of right-of-way, any right-of-way work that you need to do that's outside the local agency's current right-of-way needs to be covered by this right-of-way work that we're doing here, whether it's a minor collector, which is not on the federal aid system, or a major collector, which is on the federal aid system. That part doesn't matter for following the right-of-way rules.
Yeah.
I think that's what, maybe Julie, who's asked that question, maybe you could clarify more if that was not the.
Yeah, it's a little confusing when you talk about state highway system versus the federal aid system. Think of the state highway system is part of the federal aid system. We just have we have freeways, we have expressways, but we have some state highways that are conventional streets and roads through a city. And so if it's designated that, the classification could come down to being that it is a principal arterial. It could be a major collector. So state highways can fall into those categories. So hopefully that clarifies that concept between the state highway system versus the federal aid system.
I think as it relates to the right-of-way part, if you're working on Caltrans right-of-way on the state highway system, if your project goes off your local road and onto the state highway system also, then you're going to have to follow the Caltrans right-of-way manual for the work that's on the state right-of-way. Yes. Where if it's on your local roads, whatever the classification of that road is, but it's your own local roads, then you follow what's in the our LAPM.
All right, let's continue on. Our third section here is plan, specification, estimate. Another topic of the federal aid. So for construction projects, FHW requires competitive bidding, and the PS&E package helps fulfill that requirement. The PS&E is part of a contract between a local agency and a construction contractor. It is required to fulfill all federal obligations. And local agencies are required to complete what's called the LAPM 12D, another form, the PS&E checklist. And this is to help ensure that the minimum required provisions are included in the contract documents. And the local agency will also certify that the PSE has been prepared in accordance with the LAPM and fulfills all federal requirements. As mentioned, the local agency is required to submit this checklist with their construction requests for authorization. This checklist covers geometric standards and exceptions, sources of the source of their standard plans and specification, and federal contract provisions. Part of the federal contract provisions is the inclusion of Federal Form 1273, which is in our manual under 12G. This is federal boilerplate language that must be included in all construction contracts, including subcontracts. We were audited some time ago by FHWA. They just audited Caltrans. They picked 50 random projects and looked at construction contracts. It was a perfect 50 and 0. 50 projects. None of them had the Federal Form 1273 physically incorporated. They had it in by reference. FHW came back and said, that's not good enough. And so from that point forward, we've been emphasizing this boilerplate language must be physically incorporated into each contract. Federal wage rates must also be physically included by they can be included by reference at the time of advertising, but physically attached to the project's final contract with the contractor. And then non-collusion certification protects the integrity of the federal aid program and serves as a tool in prosecuting construction contract bid rigging. And local agencies are required to ensure conditions and restrictions associated with environmental permits are incorporated into the PS&E. So all projects on the state highway system, we use the Caltrans standard plans and specifications. But projects on the national highway system. So I've been talking about route classification. Then I mentioned about how the national highway system was initially created was interstates and the strategic routes to connect port facilities, etc. And then it was expanded to incorporate all the principal arterials. And so when that happened, these became part of it. So for projects on the national highway system, they may use Caltrans standard plans, or they may use referred to as the Green Book, AASHTO Green Book. Local approved plans may not be used for those, but they can be used. Local standard plans can be used for any project that's off the national highway system. So local developed standard plans especially may be used.
I think it's important to note that locally approved standard plans are not ad hoc plans. They have to be formally approved.
Yep, that's correct. They must be established and they must be assigned by a licensed engineer. So They must be approved by the governing board of the agency. So they, whether it's the board of supervisors, county board of supervisors, city council, and they must be signed off by a California licensed engineer. The engineer's estimate is used to authorize the construction phase and must reflect the anticipated costs of the project in sufficient detail. It is to be broken down to segregate participating, non-participating costs. Non-participating costs are typically work ineligible for federal funding for various reasons. A utility that's not federally eligible. The estimate needs to be broken down into individual contract items. And any materials purchased by a local agency and furnished to the contractor for mandatory use must be acquired on the basis of competitive bid, except for the cases where there is, again, a public interest finding. And then the agency must submit that 12F. The estimate should include contingencies, including supplemental work, which can range in about 5 to 10%. If the local agency wants to utilize federal funds for construction engineering, then the CE needs to be identified as part of the estimate. If force account or day labor is to be included in the project, it must be listed on the estimate as a separate item. Again, this must be justified through the 12F, that public interest finding. Final design is any design activities following preliminary design expressly includes the preparation of final construction plans and detailed specifications for the performance of the construction work, which will ultimately be used in the PS&E package. So we keep talking about, when you can start final design once NEPA is completed. All federal aid construction projects must be completed by contract award to the lowest responsible bidder in a competitive bid process. In addition, local agency may not, under any circumstance, negotiate with a bidder prior to award to reduce the price of construction contract. And force account may be utilized if deemed cost effective. And again, that public interest finding must be submitted. The PS&E package is required to be submitted with the construction request for authorization. It'll include the PS&E documentation, the project's plans, specification, and estimate, the PS&E checklist, and the PS&E certification, which has been incorporated into the 3A. Before we go into our quiz, are there any other questions?
Yeah, there was one question about timing that says, what happens if there are changes to the specs after the authorization's approved? Can we make the changes prior to advertising?
That's one of those depends.
Yeah, I think it depends also. And my thought was you can do change orders. I think there's also the case where plans get edited during advertising. And at that point, every potential bidder needs to be notified of those changes before the bids can be accepted. But I think for minor stuff, and again, it can't change the cost, it can't change the other stuff that was already part of the authorization. But if it's a minor change of a spec that doesn't change the other stuff significantly, then maybe that's
Yeah,
Uh,
I think the key thing there is notifying all the potential bidders of these changes. So it's the answer to the question is there a process? Yes. It's just the key thing is notifying all the potential such that everyone has equal footing as to putting their bid package together. That's the important part, that it is fair to all parties who are interested in bidding on the project. So I see a question that came up. What is the process if there are no bids during a competitive bidding process? I actually have a good example of that. And it's one project that was up in Susie's area in up in District 1. Susie's up in Eureka. I don't know if I think this was a Humboldt County bridge preventative maintenance project that the district put it, or the county put it out, and I believe they may have gotten one bid, but it was extremely high. And they said, well, we re-advertise was the first step. Re-advertise it, same thing happened. And they kind of reached out to people, after the bids came in, they kind of reached out to some of the bidders who people who interested in bidding on it, but did not. Why? Why didn't you bid? Well, they were basically saying it's a small project. It's very, very rural, away from things, mobilization, and all these things are going to be expensive. And it just wasn't worth our time to work on a project like this. So the county ultimately came to this decision. Yes, hiring a contractor was going to be cost prohibitive. They turned around and said, we'll do it by force account. They'll do it with their own forces. They already did the justification because they went through the process and came back and said, nobody's bidding on it. We can do this cheaper ourselves. And that's a perfect example of when force account does make sense. So, okay. So on the engineer's estimate, is it recommended to specify no non-participating? Yes, absolutely. Non-participating work has to be separated out on the engineer's estimate. It has to be showing that this is non-participating. So I think we've got all the questions then answered. So with that, I'm going to go.
Let's start the quiz.
Before we do,
Oh,
so it said the force account that the city can hire their own contract. I was saying force account is the city doing the work themselves, not hiring a contract, but using local forces instead of contracting it out. So, okay. All right. So this morning we did a PE authorization. Now we're going to take this same project and go to construction. So again, a reminder, we're dealing with this D Street rehabilitation. And here's now the required supporting documentation. Construction. More documents that need to be submitted. And we're going to be going through majority of these. So we're reviewing the following document. So we'll be reviewing all these documents, the FTIP, FSTIP, NEPA, the right-of-way cert, PSNE checklist. And we have another one here called the 15A, local agency construction checklists. And we're going to, again, complete this 3A. Here's our environmental, our FTIP, FSTIP. And even though we're in the 23-24 fiscal year, well, we're at the end of the year. We could advance this project through EPSP, but looking at that, there's 468,000 programmed for construction. So let's look at the environmental document. This was prepared well before the start of construction. So what is the scope of the work? Is the scope consistent with what's being requested? Again, it's important. Work in the environmental document covers the entire project that is going forward for construction. If there's work outside of it, the environmental document is no good. This project will be rejected back to the local agency. So our scope is rehabilitate D Street from East North Avenue to East College. That's as consistent as you can get. Continuing on. So the determination form, there's a basis of where it is in the U.S. Code of Regulations. And Code 26 is from the CFRs, which happens to represent the type of work. The environmental specialists can help you ensure that this gets filled in correctly. And it should also be identified on the preliminary environmental study. And as previously mentioned, NEPA approval has been delegated to Caltrans. Therefore, NEPA document needs to be signed by both the environmental branch chief and our district local assistance engineer there. And whenever needed, the NEPA form includes a continuation sheet to identify environmental commitments or supplement the scope, project limits, anytime, like I said, the description or something that goes on, it just has the ability to add additional information. Our next document reviews the right-of-way cert. To refresh your memory, there are two different certs for off system. In this case, we're going to look at the short form. Again, looking at the project description is important to ensure the location. And it's a note here. This form is intended for projects that do not require right-of-way acquisition, relocations, and have no railroad. Only the utility relocation involvement is limited. So only utility relocation involvement. It's really utility cover adjustments. As the form is completed, there are checks to be verified that the short form is acceptable. If any condition exists that directs you to use the 13B, you need to stop, and the short form is no longer acceptable. Continuing, section 5 is utilities. The short form may be used again for utilities involved, utility covers, as it states here. If the utility work goes beyond, again, short form is not appropriate. The right-of-way form is certified by the local agency based off the CFRs. The local agency will sign the document. Caltrans, we only accept a right-of-way cert as to its form and content. So it is truly approved by the local agency. But like I said, we have review, and we can, if we don't accept it, we're basically going to tell the agency you need to correct certain things. So so it's a little different language. I'm not sure why, but that's just the way it is. Since we're dealing with utility cover adjustments, the utility cover adjustment summary needs to be completed as part of the right-of-way cert. The utilities need to be segregated by those to be adjusted by the utility owner and those adjusted by the construction contractor. So it's where you got an A and a B. That investigation will ultimately make the determination whether the adjustment is to be federally eligible. For our project, we have 2 cover adjustments that will be included in the construction. Here's that city manhole covers, which have been determined to be federally eligible, and the gas valve covers, which are not. and then one additional document that needs to be required. That's the 14C, which will be provided by Caltrans to the local agency for each participating utility. This form will describe the relocation work and an estimate. Again, there's a couple other things. I'm going to kind of jump ahead. We're looking at this item. We're also looking at the estimate. So on to the 3A. We'll carry over project information from the PE phase. I'm going to tell you right here now, this form is smart, but it's not super smart. It will, if you were to take your previous version and then update this to be for the new, some information will be lost, some information needs to be re-entered, and I'll explain why. And since we are moving on, so we're going to be doing construction, and since we are now proceeding to the next phase, it is now time to update the project end date. And of course, that risk PE does not apply. So as a reminder, the initial PE was based on the PE phase and using the construction advertisement date as the phase completion. 1 year was added to establish the PE. For construction phase, the construction authorization must occur before construction advertisement. Look at that. And the construction phase completion date is the board or council construction contract acceptance. And then 1 year is added to that date. And now our PED has been established. So we go back to our 3A, just estimated completion of this will be March 11th, 2026, and there add that one again, 1 additional year. Something I didn't point out, you'll see that the estimated phase completion date, that cell's in a light blue where the PED is in a gray. The blue cells are cells that you can fill in. The gray cells are cells that are automatically filled in based on other information. Again, the federal amount requested will be automatically filled in based on the project funding. So since we were dealing with this, the PE phase was previously authorized, and we'll just shows the previous authorization. And again, this had to be entered manually on the new form because it does not carry over automatically. For the construction authorization, the key part of completing the 3A is the engineer's estimate. The 3A has a built-in tool for entering the estimate, but you may opt out of using the 3A by checking this little box here in the bottom. But for our purposes, we're going to use the estimating tool. Some of the components of the estimate include the use of multiple federal fund types. We talked about a project that was earlier that's funded with multiple federal types. You click on this will add some different columns in for the different fund types. And then you need to segregate your costs as to how much applies to federal fund type A versus fund type B. There are also special elements of the engineer's estimate, such as agency furnished material or supplemental work. You may check the appropriate boxes, and the estimate will automatically add in lines to the estimating tool to enter this information. Now we'll enter the project's estimate, starting with asphalt concrete. We enter the unit quantity, unit price, and the item cost is automatically calculated, along with subtotals. You then need to determine if this contract item is federally participating or not. So in our case, it is participating. To add additional lines, you click on the little black box, which has got a little plus sign. I'll add lines. But I've just simply completed the estimate to speed things along. And you'll notice that we have a non-participating utility item that's associated with the gas valve covers.
And Peter,
Yes.
I just want to really super highly recommend that the agencies always put in at least a little bit under their construction engineering row, because you can always move that money out if you need it to cover a higher bid, but you can't really you can't add it in later. So the construction engineering covers the cost of your local agency staff to do some of their work. If you have an RE that's on staff, their salary can be covered with this, that kind of thing.
That is very important, because if you have X number of dollars and your bids come in lower than you expected, and you have this extra money, and you say, well, we'll pay for the construction engineering services. If you do not do it with the initial authorization and it's done later, you will not be eligible for retroactive back to when construction. You'll have to do an E76 to do a cost award adjustment, for example, and then incorporate. And then once FHWA approves that, then it's eligible from that point forward. So you may miss out on 2-3 months of CE costs that could have been covered. Another one is that we do allow, like I said, we typically say construction advertisement will be done under PE phase, but if the PE phase was never authorized, then construction is the one and only. If you have it authorized for construction engineering, you can actually charge to the CE costs for doing your advertising costs, etc. So you have that ability to capture those costs by doing under the CE. Right.
And Peter,
Okay.
we had a question early on that I thought wasn't, that would be better here. There was somebody who talked about timing of authorizing their construction phase and then having 6 months until they could invoice. If you have construction engineering planned within your construction here, you can start billing for that construction engineering as soon as you have your authorization back. So the time you're spending to, deal with the advertising and reviewing the bids or doing all that, you can do a billing and meet that 6-month invoice deadline that starts as soon as you're authorized.
Yeah. The other one that's a little tough is when you're dealing with state funds, the time use of funds requirements for ATP, STIP, and that. They do have a time use of funds requirements to award a project within 6 months, etc. And so those are hard, fast deadlines associated with the federal or state programs office. There are time use of funds extensions that be handed, but it's just be aware of those things can come into play with projects allocated through the CTC. So back onto this. So we need to add contingencies and construction engineering. And from our right-of-way cert, we have the gas valve, which is non-participating. So we just kind of throw in a contingency, typically is 10%. Now, construction engineering, we kind of have a ballpark of 15%. It's just to show you can go over it. You do need to get approval if you are going over through the DLAE, and that we just want to show that, yes, we can give an economy of scale with a small project. It's a good possibility. The construction engineering could be higher than our typical percent. And there's our gas valve. It's not participating, so it's segregated out. So back to our form. So we're going to check get the STP funds. So we're going to go this through. And I just brought this here just for reference, so you can see the costs. So we start with, what's the federal participating cost? It's $440,000. That's the total cost of the project. Other funds would have to be $11,000 to cover the cost of the project. Now we're going to try to maximize our federal funds. So we're going to take that 88.53%, do the math, comes up with $389,532. So that's, trying to maximize. And then we, of course, have to have a local match to that, which gives us the total cost of the total cost. And that'll automatically be carried down into subtotals. We do the exact, okay, and then pro rata versus lump sum. Again, I mentioned that if you're going to use pro rata, it's questionable. But if it's at the maximum federal reimbursement rate, it doesn't matter. But I'm a good example. Is still want to call it lump sum. It's going to keep you out of trouble. And that's one of the things I want to make sure. You guys, you local agencies, have the ability to maximize your federal funds at all times. And by calling it lump sum, it's going to keep you in position to be able to do that. So we're going to do the same thing for the construction engineering. Take the 88,000. We assume other funds are covering the cost of the utility. Maximize the federal funds as much as possible. Get our reimbursement ratio up there. We have to have a match. Again, the total costs, CE totals, and of course, we got to do pro rata versus lump sum again. We're doing lump sum. And as this is going on, all the project total costs are actually being accounted for. So back to our screen here, you'll see that 467,438,000. That is the federal funds that not include the total federal funds that you see on this, less the previously authorized amount. So it is what's part of the construction engineering amount, that total. And we want to compare that to our FTIP. Remember what our FTIP showed? 468,000. Look at that. We're right there. We are just under. So we have sufficient funds in the FTIP to cover this project and maximize our federal funds. So they said that we have to do a certification of the PS&E. Must be certified by an engineer responsible for the project. Engineer may be a direct employee of the local, or in this case, it may be a consultant. The engineer must be a professional engineer, or like I said, or if it's a landscape project, it could be a landscape architect.
And Peter, we had a question about signatures on the right-of-way form, and I think it's important to note, if we're requiring a signature to be done by somebody who's registered, like here, we state it on there, and they have to put their registration number.
That is correct.
The question was on the right-of-way cert, does it need to be signed by a professional engineer? And no, it did not indicate that on that form. It should be signed by, and maybe PE is the wrong phrase, it needs to be signed by the project engineer, a person who knows the project, who can verify that the answers on that form are true. So usually that's the person in responsible charge of that project.
I'm going to jump way back to that form because there's something I want to point out. I failed to do that. Sorry, people. So there is a key part about is a resolution. There is a resolution. So the project may be advertised. So I certified, and there'll be an actual resolution that helps support this. And so it says certificate must be signed by a person authorized by a resolution from the agency. So that is what happens. Somebody has been assigned the authority from the governing body to be able to sign, and so that's what you have to. That's gives the power. Okay, so good point. I failed to bring that forward. I usually forget that. I need to wake up myself, and I'm going to go back through this. So you see, so here's our font compared to the F-tip. Boom, we're good. Certification. So again, we have to have like the PE, we have the responsible charge has to be signed again. Okay. So I talked about the PS&E checklist is required to be submitted with a request for construction authorization. This checklist has been developed to address the flexibility allowed under federal regulations and still ensure that the minimum required provisions are included in the contract documents. I'll go over a few of them, but to learn more, the PS&E is part of doing the PS&E checklist is part of the federal aid series, getting your federal project developed, designed to construction, and it goes into complete detail on this PS&E checklist. So just a couple things we're looking at. Part one, confirming the route classification. We asked about this route classification multiple times, and it's important that it be consistent. And of course, our project was a major collector. Part two, PS&E consistent with the scope identified in the scoping document. So what was this? What scope this? Could be in most cases, it's the F-tip, ensuring that this is consistent with the F-tip. But we have some projects out there that actually have an application process they go through. HSIP is one of those. There's an actual application that has to be, to get programmed. So it has to be consistent. Type of construction. So our project falls under resurfacing, restoration, and rehabilitation. These are very limited in terms of what you sit there and think about the difference, but these are just kind of how the federal government dictates things. Method of construction, very important. Again, FHW expects that all federal aid construction projects be completed by competitive bidding. Any variation from this will require that public interest finding. If utilizing force account, direct performance of construction work by a local agency, a PIF, will also be required. And it's possible that you could have a component of work. The majority of the work is going to be done by competitive bidding, but an item that will be done by local agencies. I had an agency that dealt with in the Bay Area. They used their own workforces to do striping. So if there was a pavement, they brought their own forces in to do the final striping. And again, but it has to be justified each time. Environmental analysis. You have to make sure the PS&E must reflect the findings of the environmental analysis performed for the project. And of course, by checking this box, the agency certifies that the necessary actions called for from the environmental document have been responded to in the PS&E package. There's one exception, and that is there could be follow-up environmental project after it. And so, but it still is addressed in the environmental document that says we are going to do, and it happens most commonly like on a bridge project, that they're going to do some plan establishment after the construction project. And then talked about day 4 really goes into this completion of this form. The LAPM 15A. This is the local agency construction contract administration checklist. This is a very simple checklist because it is a series of reminders, is all it entails. Advertise an award. Project will not be advertised until authorized to proceed for construction has been approved by Caltrans and FHWA. That's that. Got to have your authorization before you advertise. Federal aid projects, we have a minimum of 3 weeks for advertisement. Now, these are reminders. Contract bid opening, all bids are open publicly and read out loud. Agencies are to complete and retain in their files a bid tabulation of the 3 lowest bidders. Bidders DBE commitment, EEO certification, non-collusion affidavit, non-lobbying certification, disclosure of lobbying activities, and local agency bid opening checklist. These are all things that need to be included in a bid opening, for the bid opening. And when it comes to contract award, the contracts are to be awarded on the basis of the lowest responsive bid from a responsible bidder. We'll talk about those definitions here in a moment. A bid analysis to be formed for projects on the National Highway System. And again, no negotiations with contractors prior to award. Absolutely not allowed. An award package is to be forwarded to the district local assistance engineer immediately after award. How that is defined, we define it as 60 days after contract, or it needs to be submitted with the first construction invoice, whichever comes first. That award package has to be submitted with, prior to or with the invoice. We will not process an invoice if we do not have the award package. And so the award package includes a contract award checklist. We'll now have a detail estimate. And this should be part of a 3A. And by doing a 3A, by incorporating with the 3A, if there's any award adjustments that need to be made, they can be made, and therefore, update the costs between construction engineering, or previous phases. You have the local agency DBE commitment and the resident engineer's construction checklist. And this checklist is to ensure that the resident engineer is aware that the project is a federal aid project. I'm going to give you an example, later as to when where that was a problem. And last, subcontracting. Federal aid projects require at least 30% of the contract work to be performed by a prime. And again, another signature of the responsible charge. And what are some of the significant flaws that require Caltrans to reject? And of course, it goes back to the FTIP. Same thing as before. Program, fund type, phase, fiscal year, or it's outside. We don't have our DBEs in place and on file. And again, they must be, we have annual submittals that have to be done for the 9B and the 9C. And again, not using the current forms or missing inaccurate PED. The PED, like I said, it's one of our critical dates. This is very important to make sure that that date, you're aware of that date, and that date is monitored. We have a tool on our website to help monitor PEDs. But if it's inaccurate, it's going to probably force your hand to do a authorization to move it out. And if it lapses, and then gets moved out, you're going to have a gap where you're ineligible for federal reimbursement. The quality assurance program is not on file. QAP program will ensure that materials and workmanship incorporated in each construction project conform with the requirements of the contract plans and specifications, and it must be updated every 5 years. The estimate does not match the request. Our 3A has some built-in tools to help ensure that that estimate and request work out are consistent. The engineer's estimate is not segregated. So, like pointed out, we have different items, but we have to segregate out that non-participating work. We have an incomplete PS&E checklist. Of course, the NEPA does not match. Again, NEPA is not current and needs to be revalidated. Right-of-way description is not consistent. And again, it's missing information, does not match any estimates. Utilities are shown on the estimate, but not included in the right-of-way cert. All right. We have any questions?
We have 7 minutes and 5 questions.
Yeah, let's go through the questions.
Question 1, is there an advantage to using the estimate on the form rather than Excel?
The advantage is it has some checks and balances between the total cost and when the information appears on the funding sheet. So if something's not consistent, you'll see these red numbers. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is it can be a little cumbersome, particularly if a large project that has, 50, 75 quantity items. You already have it in one place. Why retype it? There is a way to deal with that. And that is just create one single line on the estimating tool. That is the total cost of all the items. Just say construction, lump sum it, and put the totals in there. And if you need to segregate, move it into the different columns, that allows you then to put in your contingencies and still use these checks and balances between the estimating tool and the project funding section.
All right, question number 2. When you state board council construction contract acceptance, are you referring to the board council accepting the completion of the project, or my question jumped?
Yeah, it did.
Or accepting the contract award? If the latter is the intended language, what happens if the construction phase is anticipated to last longer than 1 year? Will the PED be adjusted to 1 year after the anticipated construction completion?
So when I talk about establishing the PED for construction, we use the construction, the board council acceptance of completion. And that's pretty, like I said, that's equivalent to the contractor being released from the project. The contractor is done. And so that is that date. And then 1 year is added on top of that to establish the PED. So that should take care of that. So if for some reason, so by doing that, there should be no more costs associated with the project. It's possible there could be some CE costs that, that within the internal. But the key thing here is if that goes beyond that PED, those costs are no longer federally eligible. If you need to get those costs covered, you do need to do a PED adjustment.
All right, next question. What is the maximum CE reimbursement? The slide says 20%, but the manual says 12%.
Well, yeah, I said 15. It is like 12, whatever the manual. No, I never memorized that number. It can go above that 12%. It just needs to be approved in advance. That's really what it comes down to. So that the DLA should be approving a cost to go. And so the reason, like I said, the reason I use the higher percent is to show it is possible to go above above that stated percent.
Next is an interesting question. How can you read bids out loud if you use online bidding software?
That I'm not positive as to how that all ultimately is going through. Maybe Susie.
When COVID hit, we did switch that around. It needs to be read publicly.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily mean read aloud. I do know that when COVID first hit, one of our counties held their bid openings in their parking lot. And I think they stood on the back of a pickup truck with a megaphone and read them out loud to all the public to hear the thing. You don't need to go quite that anymore, but it does need to be a public announcement of what the bids were.
I think a lot of them now also use Zoom or some similar fashion if people are not wanting to actually be in the room.
So we don't need to be at the drive-in theater and in front of the screen.
No. Okay.
All right, next question. What is the website to review PED date?
We'll put that into the chat at the next break. I'll get that posted in the chat at the next break.
And a quick answer is on the local assistance website under reports. There's a little database there that shows all the PED dates.
Correct. Yep. It's a dashboard that can go in, so you can pull up a project and you can look at all the projects of your agency and see what our status is on our PED.
So next question, for federally funded projects, do all bid openings need to be read out loud? Can electronic bids be used, such as Planet Bids?
And I'm not familiar with Planet Bids. As Susie mentioned, I think a lot of everyone's going back to some public and maybe how they can submit their bids. But it is the key thing here is there's a absolute forum to allow everyone to hear their bids, and such that if a bidder feels they need to challenge, they have the opportunity to hear what other people have bid and see their results, how their bid compares to other bids.
Last question, how often does QAP need to be resubmitted? Does that timeline change if there is a new QAP form?
Again, the QAP needs to be updated every 5 years. I'm not exactly sure how its overall certification is, because that's outside of my expertise.
I can cover that.
Yeah, Susie, thank you.
So the QAP form is your quality assurance plan for your agency. So it has a lot of different, it's formatted by you. It's a document that each local agency creates to determine how they're going to assure the quality for their lab tests, et cetera. But if you're submitting a new one or a revised one, it does need to go to the DLAE. They submit it to headquarters to be reviewed by our TransLab folks to verify that it's updated. And then I'm seeing, you were asked to update it again, even though one was approved the last year. I would have a conversation with your DLAE to verify that. Maybe there was an issue that they thought needed to be corrected. For instance, for really small projects, some of the quality assurance plans are really focused on sample sizes for really large projects. sampling asphalt, sampling, some of the products. But if you have a small project, you want your quality assurance plan to be adjusted to manage doing small sample sizes too when needed. And sometimes we've had to ask our agencies to update their quality assurance plan to be more flexible to meet their needs better. So that would again be a question to the DLAE to find out why they want you to update your quality assurance plan.